Measuring progress over the next 15 years is not as straightforward as it might seem. We'd like to talk to you about the challenges of measuring disaster risk. Please come and join us if you want to know more about measuring progress over the next 15 years in your countries. So over the past few days, there's been lots of negotiations happening in that room over there, and there's been 7 goals that are being agreed. And they require measuring your progress over the next 15 years. This is Dr. Robert Muir. I'm Julia Hall. We'd like to talk to you today about some of the challenges you should be aware of. So, why should you measure progress in the first place? Well, as former Mayor of New York said, if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. So if you can't measure your risk, you can't actually do anything about it. You don't know what you've got. So let's talk about some non-disaster related goals that have been measured over the past 10, 15 years, the Millennium Development Goals. Each of them had an ambitious target, and progress is measured throughout those 15 years. They were all non-disaster related. Here's an example. Universal primary education for all. So all children being able to go to primary school. And how is this measured? Well, a lot of data was collected. In fact, institutions needed to be set up to collect this data about enrollment rates at primary schools. Let's give another example. Reducing infant mortality by 2/3. Again, data was collected around the deaths of children under 5, and this was monitored over 15 years. So what about a disaster-related goal? So far, there hasn't been a numerical target set on this. How can we measure disaster risk? How can we measure progress? This is the first time that it's actually being discussed. So, can you actually measure disaster risk or progress over the next 15 years by counting the number of deaths from disasters? Robert?
Okay, well, it may sound very simple that you actually simply go out and collect data on disasters, and then we could measure our progress. I mean, that is actually what is likely to be agreed as part of the HFA2 process, some way of having targets of that kind. But does it actually work? Well, if you look at, for example, Haiti, in Haiti, from 1900 to 2010, less than 10 people were killed in earthquakes in Haiti. And then in one afternoon in January 2010, more than 200,000 people were killed in a single event. Now, you look at this data and you think, how would you sample that? How would you sample it from a decade of data? You might take a decade in the 19th century and you get zero deaths, and you think there was zero risk in Haiti. You might take a decade which includes 2010 and you get an extraordinary amount of deaths. You cannot simply take a decade of data and actually sample what is the underlying risk, the risk of loss of life. Now, you may think this is just an earthquake problem. It's not. It's endemic to all natural catastrophe risk, that you can't simply take 5 or 10 years and get the true average of the risk itself, of the number of casualties. And yet, here is being discussed a way forward, HFA2, which is likely to include targets which are supposed to be measured. You cannot simply measure disasters from 10 years of data. It'll give you a complete erroneous sense. You may be lucky in one decade, and the next decade you're unlucky, and you may think, oh well, we've done really badly. Our systems are not working. Or you may be the other way around. You may simply have a reduction in casualties from one decade to the next, and you may think we're doing really well. We must be doing something brilliantly, and it's simply the randomness of sampling of highly volatile, the most volatile fat-tailed distribution of losses, which is a function of disasters. So this is just data from the Philippines for flood. We haven't even included Haiyan here. It's just highly volatile. You can't just take a decade and know what the average. You can't even take a decade from data from the whole world. Even the last 10 years of casualties of across the whole Earth, it's still too volatile to come up with a true average. We don't know what the true average number of casualties per year actually is. And yet there's a very great danger. There's going to be targets built into the HFA2 process, which are going to be measured, and it simply is not going to work. So what is the answer here? Well, the answer is actually we have to create a much bigger, longer, synthetic, a modeled history of potential events. We have to create that set of possibilities in a probabilistic way by synthesizing not just one hurricane, but a whole succession of hurricanes until we have a full set of tens of thousands of years of hurricanes. Now, this takes a lot of science to actually do this, but it's actually, this is work which is being undertaken all the time on behalf of the insurance industry in a vast industry of actually what is called catastrophe modeling, on which hundreds of millions of dollars a year are spent. So it's become very sophisticated business of actually building models. You start off with the hazard. You link the hazard over 10,000 or 100,000 potential versions of next year. You link that with the exposure, what is exposed to the events themselves. Actually, what is exposed, it could be buildings, it could be people. These models are already being run to generate expected casualties in disasters by synthesizing thousands or tens of thousands of years of potential events. That is already being done by organizations like GEM, by catastrophe modelers, so it already exists. And then we link the events, the hazards, and the exposure, the buildings or the people in the path of the disasters, we link that to vulnerability in terms of actually what proportion of damage is suffered, perhaps at a given wind speed. We may have a wind speed, we get 20% loss for buildings. We may want to know what proportion of buildings collapse, then we can estimate the casualties of those people who are located inside them. So this methodology comes up with risk and risk metrics which we can use to measure risk. So we could, for example, take a baseline of some country, measure the risk today, set ourselves a target of reducing loss of life in earthquakes by 50%, and then measure it again in 10 years' time using the same model, so we're not introducing model error, to actually see, are we making progress? The only way you can actually track your targets for risk reduction is you have to model it. There is no other way of simply waiting around for the data to come to tell you the averages of risk. We simply need too many years to do that. That's why you need a model. Now this whole methodology was introduced into the insurance industry 25 years ago, called catastrophe modeling. It was introduced in particular because we had events like Hurricane Andrew, where the loss was far, far bigger than anything the insurance industry had thought about beforehand. It put a number of companies out of business. It actually created this whole demand for making these models with thousands of years of history built into them, and then determining the losses from them. So the only way, and this is what should be being used now for the disasters community. This is the future. The future of actually managing disaster risk is going to be by making models and actually using those models not only to measure your progress, but also what actions you need to take, which will get you to where you want to go. What is the cost benefit of for example, introducing a new building code, or actually having some impact on tsunami forecasts or something? That is something we can measure within the context of a model, and out of which we can actually determine what impact that has on metrics like number of lives lost or number of houses destroyed. The future of this whole area is modeling. So this is the city of Tehran. which is built right up against a big active fault. There's a big active fault running along the back of the city here. Here's a city which has not yet had its big earthquake, and yet it probably has 1,000 expected casualties every year from earthquakes. We need to track those casualties before they happen, not simply wait for the earthquake to happen, the big earthquake to happen. We should have been tracking our casualties before 2010 in Haiti in exactly this way, so we could see the casualties per year. We could actually determine what action was going to have the biggest impact in reducing those casualties, and the only way we can do that is actually by modeling it, not simply waiting for the catastrophes themselves to happen. So over to you, Julia.
So, what would we like you to take away from this talk? 3 things. Number 1, disaster goals should be measurable. We want to strive towards a numerical target, and we want to know if progress is being made. The way we can do this is by making the goals measurable. Number 2, you can't measure progress by measuring disaster loss data. So you can't count the number of deaths, you can't count the number of houses destroyed, the economic loss, the number of affected people. This will be quite random. As shown in Haiti and in the Philippines, it will be, you might be lucky, you might be unlucky to get an event within the next 15 years of the post-2015 Hyogo framework. So what do we do instead? Number 3, to measure progress, we need to model disaster risk. Most disasters which could happen have not already happened. Even if you had 100 years of perfect data, this would not actually tell you all of the possibilities. You need to use models, which will look at hundreds of thousands of possible events and their probabilities to give you an idea of your risk. You can use different standard outputs, such as average annual casualties, for example, in order to measure your progress. So what do we need to do? We need to start measuring exposure data, the buildings and the people in harm's way. And we need to start to continue to make global models. So, we would like to urge you to educate your members of state, other members of society on this topic. For more information, please read this paper. There's people handing this out. We've spent a year or so writing a paper with a think tank, the top here. Email us or come speak to us afterwards. We'd love to hear from you. So please, we'd like to take any questions on measuring risk.
Thank you. This is very interesting because the whole negotiation process, which is collapsing, And my question then is, given that these models, we don't really have, robust models at the moment, right? So does this mean that, implications for countries who actually do not want measurable, targets and all that quantitatively, does it mean that is a reasonable state at the moment,
Yeah, I mean, there is a lot of modeling work going on. There's the UN ISDR models, which have been launched at this session for the whole world. There's the global earthquake model. There's going to be much more modeling coming forward. And by the time any target you set now is being tested in 10 or 15 years' time, everybody's going to have these models, every country, because donor organizations are going to be building them and giving them away to help you make the decisions you need to take in order to find what is most effective. What? Well, yeah, there isn't. Yeah.
I'm challenging the whole thing. I'm not actually saying that's my position.
Okay. Okay.
The implications of the information. This is one of the implications, and I was trying to challenge it.
Okay. Thank you. Okay. Well, actually, thank you very much for gathering here. Please remember, if you want to manage anything, you need to measure it, and you can't measure disasters from actually what simply happens. Thank you.
Thank you.